Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Erica Perrell. I'm the communications manager at APEC, and I'm so happy you could all join us this morning. I'm going to be doing a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we begin. So for those of you on the phone, the presentations for this session are available online now, so you can follow along. They're on the APEC website under this webinar. Tomorrow morning, we're actually going to add some video of today's webinar, so feel free to share with your friends and colleagues. While you're there on our website, you'll also see we do have additional research that APEC's been doing on the economic impacts of COVID-19 in Atlantic Canada and other research topics. To make sure you're up to date on our latest research, please follow us on social media for daily updates. To receive summaries of the research that we're doing, you can also subscribe for email updates. Finally, APEC is a member-supported organization, and if you're interested in learning more about the value of APEC membership, information is available on the members section of our website. Again, the presentations for today's session are already available on our website, and a copy of the video will be available by tomorrow morning. We will send you a short survey after today's session, so please take 30 seconds to complete. With that, I would like to hand the virtual mic over to APEC's President and CEO, David Chaundy, who will host and moderate today's webinar.
Well, thank you, Erica, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us, which is now our third webinar for those of you who have been following us on this COVID-19 series. Again, I would just like to thank all our members and patrons for their ongoing support that enables APEC to continue to produce this analysis and make that available free of charge to our members and all stakeholders in Atlantic Canada. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsor for today's webinar, Build Right Nova Scotia. I very much appreciate their support joining and partnering with us on today's session. This is an unfolding series that we've been doing, looking at the potential economic impacts, the unfolding economic impacts, and today's session is going to dive into a bit more detail into the business, labor, and investment impacts, and really focusing in one industry in particular, the construction industry, and to see what's happening on the ground. And as we start to look at recovery, how that might start to unfold in that particular industry. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd just like to provide one update from the last webinar for those of you who joined us then. As you know, we have been trying to produce our own data. We are trying to make sure we have timely data. We've done our own estimates that we shared last time on the impact on output or GDP in Atlantic Canada. We'd reached out to many of our members and stakeholders to provide insights. And during the last webinar, we had questions about food supply and food prices. And I alerted you that our early warning system, or my early warning system, which was my wife, alerted me to food prices going up quite substantially. I have not had the data to confirm that until about 30 minutes ago when the CPI came out for April. And that does confirm, I just want to go on record as saying that my wife was right. Food prices have gone up 3.4% in aggregate over last year, but some increases in particular items such as oranges up 4%, potatoes and carrots up over about 10 to 11%, and some canned items like soup and baked beans up 13 to 19%. I'm not yet seeing the increase on the meat prices that she tells me has happened, so that might not happen until next month's data. But again, just want to let you know we are tracking this data. We are looking at it very carefully as we try to help you understand what these impacts are and what they mean for you. So I have been presenting the last two webinars, but behind those slides and the research and the analysis, I have a research team. Today, you're going to get to hear from two of those members of that research team, and I'm hoping that you'll hear from the third member in our next webinar, which is scheduled for June. So joining me today, I have Fred Bergman. He's our senior policy analyst. He's going to talk about the effects of COVID-19 in terms of the business and labor impacts. Followed by Patrick Brannan, our Director of Major Projects. He's going to be talking about the effects of COVID-19 on investment spending in 2020 and beyond. And then we're pleased to have two external panelists joining us today. Brad Smith, who's the Executive Director of the Mainland Nova Scotia Building Trades, as well as President of Build Right Nova Scotia, and also at this time, a Chair of APEC's Board of Directors. Brad is going to be talking about how construction firms and workers are adjusting to COVID-19 in the Maritimes. And then he'll be followed by Darren Kin, the Executive Director of the Building Trades of Newfoundland and Labrador, and he will be talking specifically about Newfoundland's construction industry and the impacts of COVID-19 on the offshore oil industry and how construction is adjusting in that province. So the plan for this morning is all our speakers will have allotted time to speak. I will then host some questions, direct some questions to them, and then we will open up for your questions using the chat feature, which you should be able to see with the 3 dots or the bubble. Just submit your questions there and we will address as many of those as we can. So with that, I will now hand over to Fred Bergman to talk about the business and labor impacts.
Well, thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. I will discuss the business and labor impacts of COVID-19 now. This chart here is based on Statistics Canada's recent Canadian Business Survey on business conditions conducted with the assistance of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Based on that data, APEC estimates Canadian private sector business revenues dropped by about $255 billion, or almost 1/4 in the first quarter of this year versus the first quarter of last year. On an annual basis, that's equivalent to a 6% drop in annual revenues for Canadian private sector businesses. APEC estimates that in the Atlantic region, for all industries, including both the private and public sectors, that Atlantic regional business revenues, including the public sector, declined by about 27% in the first quarter of this year versus the first quarter of last year. For example, Clearwater Seafoods recently reported that they had a 16% drop in sales, or a $20 million drop in revenues in the first quarter of this year. Nationally, the largest revenue losses were in retail and wholesale trade, manufacturing, construction, financial services, and the mining and oil and gas industries. This includes a 23% dip in construction revenues, which is partially linked to stalled major projects across Canada, including here in the Atlantic region, that Patrick Vanning will talk about later today, along with some of the other presenters. According to that same survey, about 40% of Atlantic firms are finding new ways to sell and changing the products or services that they're providing. For example, Irving Oil began making hand sanitizer at its refinery in St. John, while Stanfield's began manufacturing medical garments, including personal protective equipment. 1/3 of Atlantic companies report increased use of e-commerce, and households are also buying more from home, and not just businesses, via e-commerce. Only about 1/5 of businesses altered their methods of production, suggesting more room is needed to increase automation to maintain the supply chain during the pandemic. Or firms need to put more effort and spend more dollars on preparing for the health and safety requirements as the economies begin to reopen across the region. Almost 1/2 of Atlantic businesses had to close temporarily, either mandated by government or voluntarily, which explains the large drop in revenues in the first quarter of this year. Upwards of 3/4 of Atlantic firms were adversely impacted or negatively impacted or affected by physical distancing requirements. And we also saw increased use of internal virtual connections in the early part of this year as a result of digitization and teleworking. So even APEC staff are working from home. By mid-May, 3 Atlantic provinces had begun reopening their economies within 2 months of the shutdown, with the exception of Nova Scotia, which will be the last province to reopen starting in early June. For example, Newfoundland and Labrador reopened its daycares on May 11th. Yesterday, New Brunswick opened its regulated daycares, and PEI plans to open its daycares on May 22nd. New Brunswick opened its shopping malls early last week. PEI plans to reopen retail outlets, greenhouses, and nurseries, hair salons, and bottle depots, for example, beginning this Friday. Firms will still face lower demand and higher costs when they reopen as a result of the pandemic. Government business funding supports help these firms survive during the cash crunch. However, some will not make it. There will be a lagged effect on insolvency, which will impact demand for goods and services via household insolvency, and lower household demand will affect business insolvency. So we'll see insolvency at both the household and business level. However, programs like the 75% Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy are aimed at getting businesses through the crisis, but some permanent closures are inevitable. As of May 8th, about 1.7 million Canadian workers were benefiting from the 75% wage subsidy. Yesterday, the CDHOW released a report that called for further bridge financing for industries like air travel, agri-food, petroleum, and tourism and accommodation under programs like the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility. Now I will focus on discussing the labor market impacts of COVID-19. Based on the latest data from that survey of businesses, we found that 3/4 of Atlantic businesses laid off staff or reduced hours due to COVID-19. For example, Valet and Irving Shipbuilding scaled back major capital project operations in both the mining and shipbuilding industries respectively, but have now begun rehiring staff back as Atlantic economies slowly reopen. APEC estimates about 40% of Atlantic businesses laid off staff due to COVID-19, and another 36% of Atlantic businesses either reduced staff hours or the number of work shifts. 1/5 of Atlantic companies reduced or froze salaries and wages to address the cost pressures and try to offset the loss of sales. However, about 5% of Atlantic firms increased wages, hired more staff, or increased staff hours as a result of higher demand during the pandemic, such as grocery stores or liquor stores, no pun intended. Some businesses were able to absorb the shock, since almost 30% of Atlantic firms made no staffing changes. Based on the April labor force survey, retail and wholesale trade and accommodation and food services had the largest reductions in Atlantic employment. For example, Atlantic retail wholesale industry lost about 40,000 jobs since February, in other words, over the last 2 months of data, and hours worked are down about 1/4. Meanwhile, employment fell 44% in the accommodation and food services industry, and hours worked were slashed by about 2/3 in that industry. The Atlantic construction industry lost over 16,000 jobs in the last 2 months, with hours worked down by about 1/3. APEC estimates that the Atlantic construction industry laid off about 32% of its workforce, so almost 1/3, but some of these layoffs would be hired back due to the 75% wage subsidy. Across all industries, about 1 in 3 are now working from home or teleworking, up from 11% before the pandemic in February. Access to rural broadband makes teleworking possible, so provinces are ramping up these investments. For example, Nova Scotia announced an additional $15 million to speed up delivery of high-speed internet in March. Based on the April labor force survey, Atlantic Canada lost about 170,000 jobs since February, a 15% drop in employment. Hours worked fell by twice as much, a little over 1/4. Unemployment has risen. The unemployment rate in particular has risen from 8% to 13%, or a 5 percentage point rise. However, 39% of the regional labor force is underutilized, up from 17% in February 2020. In addition to the unemployed, the labor underutilization rate includes those who are working less hours or those that are temporarily laid off or on furlough, for example. About 40% of recent job losses are viewed as temporary, so upwards of 68,000 jobs could be hired back by mid-year as the Atlantic economy reopens for business. The recovery will require all hands on deck, including new entrants to the labor market, such as youth and the long-term unemployed, for example. I will now hand over the webinar presentation to David.
Well, thank you, Fred, very much for that discussion of the business and labor impacts. And now we'll continue with Patrick talking about the investment outlook for Atlantic Canada.
Thanks, David. So this is the time of year that we'd be getting ready to release our full major projects inventory. And it's a project I've been working on for over 20 years at APEC. This year, very unique, very different, of course. For those of you not familiar, the Major Projects Inventory is a survey that we do every year that summarizes capital projects underway or planned in Atlantic Canada. So we're looking at anything over $25 million. And to gather this information, we contact the companies directly to get their investment plans. And last year we had 480 projects with a total value, potential value of $141 billion. So we did collect a lot of information before COVID-19 hit, but we've also had to follow up with companies to see what the impact of COVID has been on their capital investment plans. And obviously a lot of things are in flux at the moment. Heading into February this year, we were expecting a very strong 2020 in capital spending, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador and PEI in Nova Scotia. That's no longer the case as COVID has slashed anticipated spending this year. In the chart on this slide, you can see from project developers, nearly 3/4 say there has been an impact. 24% saying a major impact, so that means there's significantly less or no spending likely this year for that group. Another 48% saying some impact, the timing's been delayed or there's some additional costs. So certainly a lot is happening there. And in our conversations with project proponents, we're hearing that productivity is lower due to safety and fewer workers, but has been improving as time goes on. It is a common strategy for businesses that are struggling or if there's a recession to delay their capital spending. Several projects planned to get underway this year will be delayed until later this year or potentially deferred until 2021 so companies can control their expenses. Supply chains are an issue for some. There's a delay in machinery and materials. Some international shipments are twice as long as usual. And there will be additional costs to ensure safety, lengthening project schedules. There'll be higher overhead and equipment rental costs, expedited shipping for things that they need right away. And they're all impacting projects and budgets for companies. Moving on to our updated forecast. The combination of COVID and the plunge in oil prices has led to a collapse in oil investment in Newfoundland and Labrador, but the impact of COVID is really hitting every province across the country. We've cut our forecast for major project spending in 2020. Our fall forecast for 2020 was about $12.5 billion of spending this year in Atlantic Canada. Now we're expecting that to fall to $8.2 billion. That's a drop of about $4.3 billion, or 35% reduction in Atlantic Canada this year. All provinces are being impacted, and Newfoundland and Labrador by far the most. A 50% decline in capital investment expected there this year over what we anticipated. Around 17 to 20% decline across the maritime provinces. Spending in 2021, looking ahead, will be supported by some of those deferred projects from this year. We'll see some federal stimulus pick up next year, but challenged as well by tighter financing, uncertain investors, and weak demand. But the main factor, of course, will be the duration and impact of COVID on the global economy. The overall spend for 2021 is weighted slightly on the downside. Our current projection about 10% below 2019 levels and slightly below our forecast for 2021. So we do expect it to be up strongly from this year, but with still a major downside risk on the duration of COVID. Looking at commodity prices, they're very important for many major projects, including those in the oil and mining sectors. The impact of low demand for oil due to COVID, high inventories, and the Saudi-Russia price war have knocked oil prices by 60% since January. And that's having an impact on corporate profits and provincial royalties. That scaled back investment and employment by firms and lower royalties impacts Newfoundland and Labrador's ability to fund programs. Oil prices are expected to end the year averaging about $34, but we will see considerable volatility as expected as economies start up and slow down depending on their ability to keep COVID in check. And even over the last 2 months, we've seen a lot of volatility. In 2021, the current estimates are around $47 for oil prices. That will provide some support for oil activity. Some other important commodities to Atlantic Canada have also lost some ground due to weak demand. You see them there on the chart, except gold, where prices are strong at the moment, and that'll help move projects forward in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. Looking at the industry overview, weaker global demand caused by COVID-19 will impact a wide range of projects across Atlantic Canada this year. Darren will dig into the details on the oil and gas side of things. One thing I would like to mention is one of the bigger ones. Husky was planning to spend about $1.1 billion this year in Newfoundland, and that is largely gone. The West White Rose project's on hold until next spring at least. 900 workers were on the project at the time when they scaled it back. The mining sector expected to be a big driver this year, but with Vale's $2 billion underground mine in Labrador shut down for 2 months, it is slowly starting to ramp up again, but not expected to be at full capacity when it does. The next big iron ore project, the Kami project, is on hold due to financial difficulties, partly due to COVID. Electricity spending will be lower. Muskrat Falls is on hold, putting about 500 people out of work, and that'll push first power into next year. A few other things on the electricity side, the $60 million wind farm in PEI also being pushed back into 2021, and that one in part due to supply chain issues. Utility CapEx also being scaled back, including a $100 million cut at Nova Scotia Power this year. Housing investment expected to be up this year, especially in Charlottetown, Halifax, and Moncton. But several new builds are likely to get pushed back, and ongoing construction will be slower than planned generally across the region. Although those three markets, we do expect to see strong levels historically. So still strong construction years for housing in those three markets. Manufacturing taking a bit of a hit this year. Irving paused work at the shipyard on the Arctic Offshore Patrol vessels. Again, work is increasing there as they start to ramp up activity, but it will be well under capacity as well in 2020. Planned expansions at aquaculture and cannabis will roll out slower than planned this year. Irving Oil also unlikely to schedule its annual turnaround project in 2020. On the transport side of things, highway spending will continue, but airport investment will be scaled back across the region due to challenges in that sector. And then the last group that I'll talk about is on retail, new hotels, cultural and tourism related projects, new office construction. All those areas expected to be lower in 2020 due to challenges in those sectors. On a positive note, construction activity has already rebounded from its lowest levels in early April. The chart here shows construction machinery utilization in North America. The dotted line is what is expected typically, and the blue line is what's actually happening. It shows how many heavy equipment engines are actually running compared to what was expected. And after dropping from about 45% in the first week of April, it has ramped back up very quickly and up to 90% in the first week of May. So the earth is moving on projects, and that's definitely a good sign. So looking at now at some of the factors affecting the recovery in major projects, the weak oil demand is expected to continue. The duration, again, will depend on the length of the COVID impact. Demand will slowly increase over the course of the year, but inventories still remain high, and prolonged lower prices would certainly imply a long pause in Newfoundland offshore activity. And that province will need to be creative to encourage companies to continue to explore or develop projects in the province. Supply chains, access to major suppliers in Asia and Europe will be challenging. Some firms may not exist in the future, and transportation lags are out there. And that's going to add more cost into projects, including more diversified supply chains will be important for projects. Brad will talk about safety, so I'll leave that one. Investors will be cautious with less money to spend, and developers will need to work harder to make their case for financing for projects. And in the coming months, we do expect more projects to be postponed or scaled back as companies shift from survival mode to building mode. And then lastly for me, how do we support the recovery? Poorly timed and broad stimulus isn't the answer. It's important to note that all the money flowing from government now is not stimulus, it's about survival, maintaining cash flow for companies and individuals. The first stimulus announcement by the federal government did come last week, a $3 billion stream to make buildings more pandemic resistant and encourage outdoor activities. The federal government's going to pay 80% of the project, and that'll lessen some of the burden on the provinces and municipalities. And that'll help a bit this year, but really 2021, it'll start to have an impact. Generally, we need to start thinking smarter about stimulating the economy. We need to restart and speed up the approval process so existing projects can advance and help people get to work faster. Supporting training, automation, and investments that lower current and future construction costs will also be very important. And the focus on automation and digitalization, especially in low productivity sectors like fishing and construction and manufacturing, will help prepare for the coming demographic and labor force crunch that still hasn't gone away, even despite what's happening. And lastly, rethinking the use of space and construction for safety. A lot of companies in the design and early construction phase will spend more time rethinking the social distancing elements of their projects. Wider hallways and sidewalks. How does working from home impact office construction? finding ways to improve separation of people in new manufacturing facilities, and new layouts of hospitals and schools and nursing homes. A lot certainly will change in the use of space in the coming years. That's it for me. Back to David.
Thank you, Patrick. So you've heard from two economists talking about the different business, labor, and investment impacts. Now we're going to look at what's happening on the ground, and we'll begin with Brad Smith to talk about what's happening in the mainland Nova Scotia and Maritimes construction sector.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to highlight really three challenges the COVID's created for specifically on the industrial, commercial, and institutional construction sector, and particularly the impacts on the contractors and the skilled trades that build the infrastructure. And the three areas are safety, productivity, and supply chains. Now, in broad terms, I would describe the impacts as uneven and creating imbalances on so many different levels. I'll give you a simple example. Last Thursday, StatsCan reported that 1 in 5 or 20% of the construction workforce in Canada lost their jobs last month. That's a big headline, but not an accurate picture. BC, as an example, had very high activity and continues to be very busy, where Quebec, which has a very large portion of the construction workforce in Canada, was completely shut down and is now just opening. And as you know, we highlighted by Darren and myself, in Atlantic Canada, we have similar geographical unevenness to those numbers. And it rolls down to right down into the individual sectors, individual trades, and individual contractors. Throughout, it's uneven and unbalanced. So we look at safety first, and we'll talk about that. Safety is paramount in the construction industry, and we had to respond immediately because in Nova Scotia and in the Maritimes, most of the construction activity continued and was not shut down. And, you know, so we had to respond to that new work hazard really quickly. And one of the positive outcomes of this challenge was the extraordinary amount of cooperation by industry, Build Right Nova Scotia, others, the supported the Nova Scotia Construction Safety Association, and many others came together. And the result is we had a complete worksite guidelines and protocols in place on April the 4th, something that some sectors and businesses are just now trying to tackle. Now, construction had a bit of an inherent advantage because we're in the business of mitigating risk in dangerous work environments. But mitigating risk for a fall hazard that you can physically see is much different than dealing with an unseen virus. And then the need to educate, train, and try to reinforce behavioral change for 15,000 ICI workers, and that would just be in Nova Scotia alone. Now, the good news to that is the Occupational Health and Safety have been out there inspecting the sites, and they've reported the very good compliance to the public health requirements, and the contractors and the workers were taking the COVID threat very seriously. Which brings me to the second point. The bad news is all this new COVID mitigation protocols has had a very negative impact on productivity and scheduling. Again, uneven depending on the work site or the trade. And this obviously results in very direct costs to the bottom lines. And if you're a contractor that bid on a fixed price in the old world and now have to deliver in a COVID world, the math just doesn't work. And of course, it puts significant stress on the liquidity of the contractors as a result of that. And when you look forward, how do you bid on future work? What are the new productivity formulas? And we're not talking about tweaking. These changes are causing some fundamental impacts and changes to the business models and how construction businesses operate now, and are going to have to continue to operate in the future with this new safety protocols and the threat of COVID. There are, however, lessons to be learned, and we've learned from the past. It was not that long ago that fall arrest equipment and training did not exist, and safety was seen as an expense to the industry, and industry matured over time to realize that safety was more than just doing the right thing. It was good business. But having said that, we still cannot diminish the speed and scope and the magnitude of the pain during this transition period. So finally, a couple comments around supply chains that Patrick talked about. Typically, people think about supply chains, they think of materials. And we're all aware of the many stories and challenges around current supply chains. And a construction site, also you need to think of a construction site almost like a production line. And you need the right materials at the right time, at the right place, or production just shuts down. Now, if you think of labor as a supply chain as well, you need specific skilled trades at the right place at the right time. And you need to keep in mind in the ICI sector, it is the same skilled workforce that works from project to project to project. And again, we're experiencing very uneven and unbalanced labor supply. Some we have lots, some we're getting tight on the labor supply. And the construction workers face the same challenges and fears as all other workers, whether they can or cannot work in this COVID environment. Now, when you look forward on the supply challenges, we all are very aware of the demographic challenges and things like that, but now we've got added challenges is how do you recruit and train when the technical schools are shut down? How do you do safety training? Labor mobility in our old world would help smooth out supply gaps by moving workers between jurisdictions. How do you do that with closed borders? So again, many, many different impacts that makes the things uneven and unbalanced. A couple things that we do know is COVID's here and it's not going to magically disappear. And I think we're seeing more and more of the industry accepting this is it. This is what we have, and this is what we need to innovate and adjust to. Activity has already been highlighted. We're seeing it continues to increase. And my estimate was Nova Scotia was running at about 70%, and that continues to grow up, which I think is being supported by the numbers that were presented. But by how much and over what period of time will again be unbalanced and uneven. And but again, there's good stories and innovations happening around that. I'll use the fall arrest example as an obvious one. You know, renewals of licensing for fall arrest is now happening online, where the workers have to demonstrate over the web or video the proper use of the equipment, where before that would be a class and a bunch of workers in a class for a good part of a day. Augmented reality was started being used in different trades and was underway, and this certainly will accelerate the use of AR and those technologies for training workers. And the workers and the contractors will get more efficient on the work sites with these new safety requirements. So I guess in summary, it's our first priority is to keep those work sites safe so that we can keep them operating. That's our biggest risk factor at this point, is making sure that we keep those sites safe and open. And we'll continue to work through and adapt to these new challenges, and hopefully over a period of time we'll get the balance back into the system, but you should not in any way diminish the pain and the structural changes that are going to have to happen in the construction industry for it to move forward in a profitable manner. So I'll flip it back to David.
Great, thank you, Brad. So you've heard a bit about on the ground, and now we'll hear from Darren to talk about Newfoundland and Labrador specifically and how they're faring in this industry.
Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to have a chat this morning. And like all of you on the line, of course, us here in Newfoundland and Labrador have felt the wrath of COVID, and it's certainly taken its toll on the industry. Luckily, in the big picture, people have taken the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and others, and we've been able to flatten the curve. And I think we're on a real good run now of 12 or 13 days with no new cases. But COVID has had a pretty significant impact on projects here in the province. Once mid-March occurred and COVID was announced, we saw a number of major projects. I think Patrick touched on a couple, but I'll repeat them. Moved into care and maintenance mode. The Muskrat Falls Hydro project, at the time, we're somewhere between 600 and 700 people employed. Right now we're in care and maintenance at about 80. The Husky West White Rose Extension project, we were in the ballpark of 750. Firm numbers are not available, but estimates tell us we were about to ramp up to somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 people. We're now at about 30 in care and maintenance there. The Valet Voisey Bay Mine expansion project was reduced to a small crew with hundreds sent home. And as well, the North Atlantic Refinery stopped production at its location in Cumberchance. Not only, of course, were these big blows, but we also saw announcements on potential new projects being delayed. Equinor was the first, I think, announced that it was pausing the Beta Nord project, and this would have been a fairly significant project, which included the construction of a deep water platform for drilling. North Atlantic Refinery delayed their expansion projects, and there were a number of those. Hibernia drilling stopped, and their proposed tieback project was cancelled, and the Terra Nova FPSO at a half a $500 million life extension project that was placed on hold. And now recently we're told that potentially could be up to at least 2022. So these delays had a pretty significant impact on the province, on our organization in particular. We have approximately 18,000 members, and right now we're sitting at about 15% employment rate. So we have about 85% of our membership unemployed as a result of the downturn. On a positive side, we are seeing work continue in a number of infrastructure projects and others. Mining production and maintenance is continuing at our site at the IOC in Lab West, as well as Takora Resources. And that's driven in large part to a strong demand and prices for iron ore commodities. We also have a number of public infrastructure projects funded in whole or part by the provincial government. These are continuing, so they would include the core science building at the university, the healthcare facilities in Corner Brook and Bay Vert, long-term care facilities in Gander and Grand Falls, Windsor, and we have a couple of new schools construction that's continuing. All of that, of course, as you would be aware, is continuing in very different circumstance from when the tenders were first awarded, different circumstances for workers and contractors. But I want to come back in a few minutes I have just to circle back to the oil and gas sector because of the importance of the industry, not only to Newfoundland and Labrador economy, but I think to the Atlantic provinces and to the entire country. As many would know, the oil and gas has probably been described by many as Newfoundland and Labrador's lifeline over the last 15 or 20 years. For us at peak between 2003 and 2008, oil and gas contributed roughly between 33 and 36% of our GDP, and currently still sitting at 23%. The value for this current year to the province is $6.1 billion. And from other projects that we've done in the past, and that would include the start with Hibernia, Terra Nova, Sea Rose, Hebron, as well as the Come By Chance refinery in Whiffen Head, there have been approximately a combined 20,000 construction jobs created through these projects. Those workers come from hundreds of communities, not only in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, but particularly Atlantic Canada. And as everybody knows, when trades workers are employed, everyone benefits. The industry estimates that for every job in construction industry, there's a ripple effect of approximately 7 indirect or support jobs created. So it's certainly had a pretty significant effect on us, and I guess where we've moved to now is what's next and how do we stimulate the economy and what needs to be done. So as an organization, we've been pretty well engaged with the Premier and government, our opposition parties here, the Construction Labour Relations Association, as well, in particular the NOIA, our Newfoundland Ocean Industries Association, and offering whatever support we can provide to be a part of the economic stimulus. We've taken the position that, we don't believe government itself has a responsibility to do this. We believe government has to lead the charge, but others of us, like you on the line, need to step up and be a part of finding solutions. One thing that we do believe is that any plan that governments come up with has to have some kind of immediate job creation. So we've basically focused on 3 particular areas. We're advocating that stimulus infrastructure funding needs to come forward. Projects that I think Patrick may have touched on this, but projects that are in the queue, either delayed or about to proceed from the federal and provincial governments, we're advocating that those continue and focus on through those immediate job creation with obviously the resulting spin-off benefits for the support jobs. The other 2 that we're advocating for and partnering with NOIA and many others in the province here tailor specifically towards the oil and gas industry, and that would be for the establishment of exploration initiatives for the oil industry in particular. And we know from past experience and research, for every $100 million of exploration investment or well drilled, there are about 650 jobs created, and the GDP in Canada grows by about $84 million. And that's whether or not oil is discovered. That's just the fact that the result of the well being drilled. So that's pretty significant, and we're advocating for that to continue. And the third piece, of course, is around development initiatives for resource development sector in the province. And as you heard me say a few minutes ago, our resource sector has been hit pretty significantly. So we believe there's a role for government to bring forward some development initiatives. But all of this is obviously going to take some time and some effort to move forward. As Brad touched on, there's going to be a new normal for us in construction with COVID, and all of us collectively have to figure out what that means and take the appropriate actions. We certainly recognize that the future is going to look much different than what we've been used to in the past, but we all have to be ready to embrace that and move forward. The one thing I'll conclude with is, as I've said a couple of times, through my own experiences in this role and others, I've seen that construction is a real good stimulator of the economy. It puts people to work very quickly. It gets money flowing in the industry, and it provides a lot of indirect support jobs to the industry. So we certainly look forward to further discussion on this, but we're certainly advocating very strongly here in the province for an aggressive plan by the federal and provincial governments to affect our public infrastructure investment and our oil industry and our mining industry in particular. With those few comments, I'll conclude and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Darren, and very much appreciate that. So let me just kind of start on some of our questions. The first one is for you, Fred. As businesses look to the recovery, what are some of the key factors that they kind of will be looking at or need to address as they think about kind of getting their business operations back up and running?
Well, one of the factors they need to consider picks up on some of the discussion Brad had on, as well as Patrick, on the need to comply with health and safety requirements, including things like physical distancing and occupational health and safety, or OHS for simplicity. There's an onus on businesses to protect workers under most provincial legislation, but sometimes there's additional clarity required on the rules because this is a whole new ball game. And what do companies have to do as they reopen to protect OHS and maintain physical distancing in this new world, this new normal? Also, a number of industries are facing lower demand, which I talked about, even after the economy reopens, especially those that rely on the lifting of border restrictions. We heard yesterday that the Canada-US border is going to be closed for another 30 days. Up to June 21st. So obviously that's going to continue to have an impact on air travel, tourism, and accommodation, for example, as well as a number of other industries. Another couple of factors you might want to look at and consider as well as being impacted is the availability of the labor supply. This was already an issue due to demographic change. So due to aging demographics in particular. So we knew we were facing labor shortages go forward. However, this could be hampered further in the current environment. For example, workers in low-wage industries might be slow to return to work if they felt that they could earn more by collecting the Canada Emergency Response Benefit as opposed to going back to work and earning those potential wage earnings. So for more information on this, we've recently posted some analysis on our COVID website on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So go look at that SERB analysis for more details. And the final thing I want to point out, as we enter into the recovery, certain occupations are going to be in higher demand go forward. This includes occupations in the retail trade industry, such as sales and service, business, finance, and administrative occupations, as well as trades, that's skilled trades in particular, transport and equipment operators in the construction and transportation industry, as well as management occupations across all industries.
Okay, thank you, Fred. So question for you, Patrick. You talked about kind of what's happening on the ground and the role for potential infrastructure stimulus. We know in the last recession, federal infrastructure stimulus spending was an important part of the recovery. Can you just provide any perspective in terms of how effective that was, and are there any lessons from that in terms of this time around, and whether we can use the same model or whether we need to look at or think about that kind of stimulus spending somewhat differently?
Yes, the last recession took hold, I guess, in late 2008. And looking back at our numbers, we did check on that, and it was probably about 18 months later before it really started to kick in. And it did add about $1.5 billion to public sector capital spending, but certainly it ended up being slower than what was really needed because the economy was already rebounding at that point. So this time it's really important to accelerate those existing programs, ensure the funding gets to where it's needed as quick as possible. Stimulus is probably going to continue to target things like public transit and green infrastructure. We also expect a greater focus on high-speed internet this time for rural areas, more people working from home. And some will happen this year, but there will be a bigger boost in 2021. So on top of getting that quickly, it's important that it has a lasting impact on productivity too. I think I talked a little bit about that already, but it's crucial that it looks ahead and invests in building an economy that's ready for the next decade, instead of just spending large amounts of money on nice to have infrastructure that doesn't improve our quality of life. We need to get it on the ground quickly and have an impact on our productivity.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Just before I jump to some other questions, I just want to again thank our sponsor for today. And again, you can use the chat feature to submit your questions. I've got quite a few on my list to ask, but I just want to acknowledge Build Right Nova Scotia. That is our sponsor today, is a partnership of unionized tradespeople and contractors that are working together in Nova Scotia's construction industry. So again, I want to thank Brad and the team at Build Right for all their work in supporting today's session. So Brad, you talked a bit about some of the current impacts on the ground. In terms of kind of going forward, how do you see the future in construction being impacted? Is there a way that we can accelerate the recovery? And are there some positive things happening during COVID that you would maybe think should be a kind of a permanent feature of the industry going forward?
Yeah, a very broad question, but I think that we're seeing everybody already starting to adapt and come up with new ways of dealing with this. And I think the challenge going forward is how quickly we can start leveling these imbalances between the supply and demand. And when I start thinking about, when Fred starts talking about the labor supply side, when I start thinking about some of the things when the government institutional spend, which is planning and coming out, we supplied nationally, we supplied projects right across the country. For Atlantic Canada, that was using APEC research for the federal government to look at projects that were ready to go. One of the things we've been advocating is because the unevenness of the impact to some groups, we've been advocating that the projects should have a requirement for 25% apprentices. And of those 25% apprentices, 10% of it underrepresented groups. So that does two things. It helps to drive the youth employment and helps to bring more unrepresented groups into the trades. So some of what I think what you're going to see is more things that we're starting to work on are going to continue to accelerate. One of the questions is, some of the examples of AR and VR work being done. There's a training center that we're looking at nationally in Ottawa that you could actually train that work remotely all across the country using that central hub. You've got operating engineers in the country that have already been doing this with crane training and things like that. So I think the opportunity is look at some of the things we're already having success is how do we accelerate and then keep some of that. So it's about breaking the old habits and accelerating some of the new habits to get us going forward more quickly.
Great, thank you, Brad. Darren, I know you've already talked a bit about recovery and what should be done in Newfoundland and Labrador, so maybe I'll just kind of pivot a bit on some of the questions we've received. And do you have a sense in terms of kind of what, I know different provinces have got different ways they're approaching their phases and colors or levels or risks. Do you have a sense of when kind of the bigger projects in Newfoundland and Labrador, at what level they will be able to kind of fully get back up? And related to that, we know there's been a lot of interprovincial mobility in the construction industry, Newfoundlanders going elsewhere, people coming into the province to work. How is that going to be a factor in the kind of recovery, given some of the current restrictions on people traveling even across Canada?
Sure. So on the first question around projects returning, the Muskrat Falls project in particular, I'm guessing we're going to start in Newfoundland what we've called an alert level 3. We've already had discussions now for returning increased numbers to site starting in early June, which I think, as I said, in Newfoundland, it's what we call alert level 3. We started at 5, we're in 4 now, we go to 3. That's Muskrat, and I think Boise Bay will be the same. The broader issue, though, is what happens to those other projects that we talked about. And as I touched on briefly, I think it's important that if government's able to, they need to invest in shovel-ready infrastructure projects, and in the oil industry in particular, the exploration incentives and development incentives. If we don't get support on that, then there's no telling where the Equinor project will ever go and whether the Come by Chance refinery will ever do the expansion or the Terra Nova refit. So they're all tied in, I think, to some kind of a pretty positive stimulus plan from governments of both levels. As all of us know, these companies have options, and at the same time, they're trimming their investment money. So they're looking around the world at where they're going to invest, and we need to make it attractive here in the province. With respect to labor mobility, I think a lot of it, Brad touched on a nice bit of this. It's going to depend on how the provinces roll out the quarantine rules. They're different in every province. I know here in the province, and it has been an issue publicly, workers can come in from outside and they don't have to quarantine before going to work. They can go to work and simply quarantine outside of work hours. Whereas I know from national meetings in Manitoba, if you go in there to work, you have to quarantine 14 days before you can go to the work site. So I guess it's going to take some time for us to figure that out. But I think it's fair to say, at least from the island perspective here, there's a pretty heightened awareness, given that many of our major projects shut down because of COVID. There's a pretty heightened awareness on those being able to come in from outside and not have to follow the same rules vis-a-vis the self-isolation before going to work. But I think that's going to take some time. But for me, I think the bigger picture discussion needs to be around how we're going to support the continued development of the industry here, because they're outside of Muskrat and the Boise Bay. There's no guarantee that any of these other projects are really going to go back to work unless we get some support from government.
Great. Thank you, Darren. So a question for you, Fred, a question that came in just around kind of the ability of, you talked about some of the federal programs, how big is the federal bucket? To what extent did the federal government have capacity to continue providing stimulus and support without seeing any negative impacts, such as higher inflation?
Well, I know the head of the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, recently came out and mentioned that, hypothetically, the federal deficit could top $1 billion. So a large chunk of that could be federal fiscal stimulus to offset the impact of the pandemic on the economy and on health and social service expenditures, et cetera. So certainly it can have some impacts. I talked about the CERB in particular, and how the CERB may act as a disincentive for low-wage workers to return to work. And there'll be some analysis on our website, on our COVID-19 website, as I mentioned earlier. I think from another perspective, it's how do governments in general address this go forward? Will they increase taxes at some point when we move beyond the post-pandemic world? And we saw, I think recently, there was an announcement in Manitoba that they're going to institute 5 days of unpaid leave for public sector workers and government officials and so on, or I think that's the plan anyhow. And that's roughly equivalent to a 2% wage reduction across the public sector in Manitoba, at least for the provincial public sector. So we're already starting to see inklings of how we might pay for this go forward.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Patrick, a question for you. We know Charlottetown has seen quite a boom in recent years, particularly driven by immigration that's really supported their housing market. Do you have any perspective on kind of the drivers in Charlottetown right now and how that might be impacted by COVID and potential changes in terms of immigration levels?
Yeah, well, there has been a bit of a pause in the flow of immigration just due to offices being closed, but we anticipate that ramping up pretty quickly over the next few months. Construction sector and PI actually is probably the least hard hit in the region. The one big project that they have there is a wind farm that is pushed off till next year, but a lot of the housing activity and the infrastructure support for Charlottetown is still planning to go ahead. So that city is still growing, and the international student piece may be a bit of a challenge over the next little bit, but immigration is expected to continue to support growth in that province. And it has been certainly a little bit more insulated, and the tourism sector and things like that will be hit hard, of course, but construction sector will continue to grow, and I think there's going to be a continued need for housing to support that growing population. There's still a pretty big gap in terms of what's needed and what's currently available. So we're already seeing several new projects as soon as they opened up, new projects being allowed to start in Charlottetown in May. Several of them started to jump in ahead. So it should be a busy construction season, and that's important to continue to support the need for housing in the Charlottetown area, especially.
Great. And a question maybe, I don't know if Brad or Darren want to jump in on this one, but around government procurement, again, as provinces have shut down, they've been very concerned about their own borders, and they're also very concerned about getting their own economies up and running. Given previous things we've seen in the States, in particular around kind of Buy America and that type of thing, do you think there's a risk of increased protectionism at the either national level or provincial level? And any thoughts on how we might mitigate that, whether it's protecting on workers or just trying to ensure that the work goes within province to support their own economies in the recovery? Brad or Darren, do you want to jump in on that?
I'll take a quick shot. I mean, this whole thing is labor mobility has all been flipped around. At one point, the building trades in Nova Scotia, about 15% of our workforce were travelers. They moved across the country to do the project. So there's a lot of work been done with apprenticeship and others to reduce barriers for labor mobility, so people can move around, labor mobility, to make sure that you know, we got the Atlantic harmonization of the apprenticeship system on skills, and we're looking at that across the country. Labor mobility in our industry is important because it gives us the ability to respond to peak demands and move workers around. But again, all of this has been flipped on its head for right now until things settle out a little bit more. I'm not sure how clear that picture will be for the next little while until we see how things start to rebalance in terms of supply and where the pinch points are.
Great. A question for you, Patrick, just around, Fred kind of shared the numbers that teleworking was 11% before this. It's jumped up quite substantially. But as we move back into recovery, do you think that proportion is going to increase, and what are the implications for commercial office space? Are we going to see firms doing things differently with more people working at home, and therefore will that impact demand for commercial office space?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies that held off against the working from home piece are now seeing that it can happen, and that I think will have an impact on commercial construction going forward, maybe even just the rethinking of office layouts, how much office space you might actually need if more people can work from home. So I think there is going to be a bit of a shift, a rethinking for a lot of companies on how they set up their workforce, and that balance between working from home and working in offices. It will certainly change now that people have had a chance to do it, pushed in that direction, but a lot of transformation is happening in many areas, and I think this is one that we'll see some shifts in that segment.
Great. Fred, just a quick clarification for you and then another question. So you mentioned that 40% of the current or recent job losses were temporary. So does that mean that the remaining 6% were kind of permanent? If you can just clarify that. And then the bigger question is, for those firms that have shifted to producing personal protective equipment, do you have a sense of how long they will do that? Will they just do that while the demand is there for that equipment? Or once they see their own demand coming back for their own products, will they then kind of switch back? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, on the other 60% being permanent, from the other survey, the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, I noted that about 50% or one half of businesses are temporarily closed, either due to being mandated by government or voluntarily. So, some of those job losses are not necessarily permanent. They're permanent as long as the mandated restrictions remain in place. But as soon as government lifts those restrictions, hopefully some of those people start getting hired back. In addition, also keep in mind, for that 39% labor underutilization rate, that's not just the unemployed or the temporary laid off. That also includes people that had their work hours reduced by 50% or more. So they're almost considered like they're unemployed because they've had a drastic reduction in their work hours. So those people are not permanent layoffs either. But it's quite possible that, the labor market will not come back right away to where it was prior to the pandemic in terms of the level of unemployment. And that would include the labor underutilization rate as well. On the other item on the PPE, I think as long as the opportunity exists, we're going to see greater production of things related to the pandemic, whether it's hand sanitizers or face shields, face masks, medical garments, and the like. And as businesses reopen, certainly there's going to be increased demand for all those products. And I know as part of an Indigenous research project I'm working on, I know that some of the communities are actually gathering up access to 3D printers. And I think Olnewig is here at in Halifax, I think in the same building APEC's office is normally located at, printing face shields with 3D printers for Indigenous businesses. So a perfect example how businesses are morphing to meet the supply chain necessity. Yep, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. So just one quick final question for you, Patrick, and then I'll just give Darren and Brad a quick chance if they want to respond to any other comments or questions. Patrick, question just around stimulus and transit. Do you think that will be a focus given people, maybe transit users being concerned just about their own safety? So is transit likely to be a focus for stimulus spending in the recovery?
Yeah, well, it's same as the airline industry. I think there's going to have to be new models and new ways of doing things. You know, yesterday they were talking about shifting the middle seat of airplanes around the other way so that there's more of a break between people. So there may be more investments in transit, smart transit, more effective transit, and improving the quality of the buses. May be a big thing going forward. So there'll be investments in that. And I think getting people throughout the region, throughout the cities quickly, I think is going to be a crucial part of things, being more productive, having more productive transit with, you know, being cautious of the safety issues is going to be an important question going forward. So I think there'll still be some investment in all types of transit. A lot of it will be safety focused.
Great, thank you. Darren, 30 seconds. Any final comments you wanted to emphasize?
Yeah, just to underscore what Brad had said a few minutes ago, I mean, I think the future labor mobility is going to be a very key driver for all of the economies across Canada. And in our organization, you know, building trades, that's something that we've always been a big supporter of. I think the other thing, though, and I did see a couple of questions kind of flirting around with this around local jobs. I think you're going to see in the short term, because the economy is flattened out and travel is restricted, I think you're going to see a heightened look at local benefits or community benefits from either resources or projects that are funded by public money. That's not to say that will do away with worker mobility, because I don't think it will, but I do think there's going to be a heightened sense of scrutiny on what's happening in the provinces, as long as there's a fairly high unemployed rate within the skilled trades.
Great, thank you, Darren. Brad, any final comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just support Darren there. I mean, you know, thinking about hire local qualified first is one of the lenses that might be looking at. But I guess my closing comment would be, you know, we're in a crisis here. I think we shouldn't waste this opportunity to deal with some of the systemic issues that we have that we've been unable to get at over the years. This is an opportunity to actually accelerate some innovation, accelerate some adapting on some things so let's not waste this opportunity. It's here, we got to deal with it. So let's figure out how we can do things better.
Well, thank you. I'd like to, again, just thank Brad, Darren, Fred, and Patrick for sharing their thoughts and responding to questions today. Again, I'd like to thank BuildRight Nova Scotia for sponsoring today's session. Again, as we've indicated, the slides are already up on our website. The recording of the webinar will be available tomorrow. You can visit our website for further updates and analysis that we continue to post. You can find more frequent updates if you follow us on social media, but feel free to also sign up for our email updates. We do send out periodic summaries of our analysis on COVID. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We will be having another webinar before the summer, just to focus a bit more on the recovery and some of the longer term issues we need to be thinking about as we move forward and as further provinces begin to open up their economies. So again, thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.